Welcome back to another episode of the Tyndale House podcast. We're in the middle of a series looking at names in the Bible and in the ancient world. In our last episode, we started looking at the sons of Jacob in Genesis 29 and 30. And we'll be continuing that conversation today, looking at the children of the two slave women, or servant women, Bilhah and Zilpah. And the first of Rachel's children, Joseph, will be leaving Benjamin as he appears quite a lot later in the Genesis narrative. So we're back in Genesis 30, and I'm joined again by Dr. Caleb Howard, who heads up our Old Testament Names project here at Tyndale House in Cambridge, and James Bejon, who is a PhD candidate here in Cambridge and is also a member of the Old Testament Names team. So Caleb, perhaps you could start by reading the beginning of Genesis chapter 30 and introducing us to the next of Jacob's sons.
And Rachel saw that she had not brought forth to Jacob, and Rachel was jealous of her sister. And she said to Jacob, "Give to me sons," specifically sons, maybe children, sons seems to be right, "or I'll die." And Jacob was angry with Rachel, and he said, "Am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you fruit of the womb?" Which connects to something James has said earlier. And she said, "Behold, my female servant, my female slave, Bilhah, go into her that she may bring forth on my knees, and that I may be built, also I from her." And she gave to him Bilhah, her female slave, as a wife, and he went in to her, and Jacob went into her, and Bilhah conceived, and she brought forth to Jacob a son. And Rachel said, "God has judged me, and also he has heard my voice, listened to my voice, and he has given to me a son." Therefore she called his name Dan. Now the connection there in verse 6 between the name and the explanation is in that word judge. So God has judged me. Maybe judge isn't the best translation, but it's the judge word.
Yeah.
And
what do you
Dan,
think? Vindicate or something?
could be. Yeah.
I wonder if that's kind of what she means by it. Yeah.
It makes sense at this point, right? She's sort of achieved a kind of victory in the sense that she was barren before, but through giving Bilhah, she has, she's now produced children. It's quite striking that she regards the child as her own.
That's right, yeah. And almost as the continuation of her life. I mean, you could take it as, what's the word, hyperbole, couldn't you? Give me children or I am dead.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, death is in the background of all these things theologically, isn't it? It's the end of a line. If she doesn't have children, you can talk about the deadness of the womb, can't you, per Romans 4 on Sarah, you know, and it just feels like a lot of these birth narratives are set against the backdrop of death. I mean, obviously, kind of, you know, Eve's children against the, you know, you will surely die, but then the Exodus is birth against the backdrop, and it's
like the comic cases, Jacob constantly saying he's about to die.
Yeah, absolutely.
Toward the end of Genesis, he's always about to die.
Yep.
And he lives on and on. And then
until finally it happens. Bilhah is, I guess, an interesting introduction because it seems that she can play the same sort of role that Hagar.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's interesting.
So now Rachel and eventually Leah are playing the role of Sarah.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that in both cases, they are giving their female slave to the husband.
Right.
Yes.
It's like they initiate this.
Yeah. And Paul takes it forward, doesn't he, in terms of a covenant of works.
Yeah.
That's his. And you can see why, can't you? Because, like, God has closed the womb. It's said repeatedly, isn't it? You know, and of both women, actually. And I'm not saying it's an ungodly thing to do necessarily, but it's a striving against that, isn't it? And so you can see how it can be taken forward as this is the flesh working rather than the spirit. You know?
Well, that certainly seems that way. Yeah.
Yeah.
It seems an extraordinary thing to do in our culture.
Well, I think it's just bearing in mind. So there is the literary component where these themes get repeated. There's the theological component, and there's the historical component. They should not be taken apart. They're they're vitally connected. A historical component of this is that this was probably legally okay.
Right.
Sort of culturally accepted, like this was a norm,
Or,
right?
or even obliged, and Onan are struck down, aren't they? Onan is struck down for not raising up sons, and that's pre-law. So it's obviously some existing custom.
Yes.
Yeah, slightly different case. It's the other way around, but that's right. And we do have contracts where it looks like secondary wives are being taken for various reasons to bear children.
Right, that's interesting.
It's not entirely clear to me that they are, the children are fully regarded as the first wife's own children in quite the same way. Okay. But it's just not something that's altogether clear. Probably it was embedded in cultural knowledge or expectation.
Right.
And so I think it's important to recognize that this is a theme. This is helpful for the characterization of Rachel and Leah. They are being portrayed like Sarah. Yeah. They're taking in hand the solution that appears to them, that was culturally acceptable, that made sense.
Yes.
It's also that there's a historical component.
Penina may have been a similar situation, mightn't it? So Hannah is, I think, the first mentioned, isn't it? Shemachat Hannah. And so it may well be she was barren, and so Elkanah took her a second wife. Yeah.
So that's beginning of 1 Samuel with the birth of Samuel we're talking about, isn't it?
Yeah, and there were more strife. Yeah. And there the wrestling is kind of wrestling in prayer, isn't it, rather than this sort of more physical striving.
Yeah. It's a very interesting contrast.
Yes.
It is, isn't it?
Well, we have physical strivings or wrestlings immediately with the next child. So let's move on to verse 7.
All right, verse 7. She conceived again, and she brought Bilhah, the female slave of Rachel, brought forth a second son to Jacob. And Rachel said, "Strivings of God, I have strived with my sister, and also I have prevailed." And she called his name Naphtali. So here the connection is between that word strivings, in strivings of God, Naphtule, Elohim, and then also with the verb that's used, niftalti, I have strived, which sounds like Naphtali. So here we have kind of all three of those types of correspondence. There's lexical correspondence, semantic correspondence, and phonological correspondence. But as you say, there's more striving going on.
Yeah, this is one of those names, I mean, same could be true of the others, couldn't it? But this seems to be one of those names that Rachel has kind of given a new slant to, in that, I mean, it's an unusual word. Yeah. Does this occur with the sense wrestling elsewhere?
Well, I don't know about as a name. I mean, patalu in Akkadian it means twisting or that sort of thing.
Sort of same in Arabic. So you can imagine how wrestling and being intertwined could come from that sort of verb, couldn't you? But I wouldn't be surprised if it was the kind of name that got given to a child who was caught up in the umbilical cord or something like that. Sibchai could be a similar name to that, intertwined or sort of, just because there are so many names like that to do with the birth event. It's worth saying, isn't it? Like a very common name is "He has healed me" or something like Yirpa El, the Lord has healed. And getting through a birth process in the ancient world without someone dying was no mean feat, was it? And we kind of forget that, don't we? And we're talking about the backdrop of death, and so often someone is going to die.
That's right. Yeah, and later on Rachel will, when she brings forth Benjamin.
Absolutely.
So that's kind of blooming.
Which is interesting because it's another example of those word plays. Jacob will say, "Your ewes have not miscarried," which is it becomes a slightly Rachel is ewe. It becomes a slightly dark pun in the sort of that's to be the end of Rachel. And there's lots more of that sort of cattle-related imagery, isn't there? We had it in
Leah.
Yeah, Leah means cow. At the start of chapter 29, we get this interesting image of 3 flocks around the well and a 4th on its way, which Rachel is leading. Now, that seems very significant, doesn't it? I mean, Jacob is going to arrange his children in terms of 4 flocks, as in sort of Leah, Bilhah, Zilpah,
Bill's
Rachel.
Yeah.
Rachel's is going to be the last to arrive. And almost at the end of this chapter and whole section, it's still arriving because there's still Benjamin around the corner. You know? And so that image of 3 with 1 on the way is significant. It's how the sons are ordered in chapter 46. It's how Jacob sends them to meet Esau, doesn't he? In that, and so there's it just all goes with that, the way these are embedded in a narrative, doesn't it?
Yes, yeah.
It's remarkable.
Okay, verse 9.
Right, verse 9. Leah saw that she had stopped bearing, and she took Zilpah, so she's doing what Rachel did. She took Zilpah, her female slave, and she gave her to Jacob as a wife. And Zilpah brought forth, the female slave of Leah, repetitious, brought forth to Jacob a son, and Leah said, Bagad, so good fortune, or something, in good fortune. And she called his name God, which means good fortune. So it corresponds to what she exclaims when she produces the child. Yeah.
But he's Gad, not Bagad.
Bagad is in good fortune.
Yeah,
so
right,
God
okay.
is the word for fortune, good fortune, and ba, presumably, if we are reading it correctly, is the preposition in.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
There's a variant reading, isn't there? So like the Ketiv is more like, the Koreh is more like fortune has come or something.
Yeah.
Like, or
Can you just explain Ketiv and Koreh for people who don't know what that is?
These are instances where what's written would naturally be read one way, but that there is a preserved tradition of pronouncing it, reading it in a slightly different way, much like many English kind of words aren't how they look.
Yes.
And this would be, sort of favour has finally come or something like that, would it? Or is coming, could be even, but yeah.
Yes. Sometimes we do get into the weeds in these things, I suppose. That's fine.
Yeah.
Can I read the next one?
Yes,
because
do.
it's worth reading them together, I think.
Yeah.
Okay.
So verse 12, and Zilpah, the female slave of Leah, brought forth a second son to Jacob, and Leah said, in my happiness, because daughters have made me happy, or regarded me as happy, maybe.
Yeah.
And she called his name Asher, which means happy.
Yeah.
So there's a connection then between what she exclaims again. So much like Leah exclaimed Bagad with the preceding birth, here she says something similar. There's a correspondence between the use of Asher in her exclamation with the preposition before it, if we're reading it correctly, if we've understood it correctly. So in good fortune in verse 11, and then in my happiness in verse 13. And then the name corresponds to that. Yeah. And the reason I wanted to read it is just that, there's a lot of complexity here that helps us to work out what's going on when names are given and how they're interpreted, for one thing. So in verse 13, daughters have regarded me as happy, maybe. And presumably the idea is that other women will look on her circumstances and think, well, that's good.
Yeah.
Celebrate her, so to speak. The boys named in that connection. But then also, these are two sons of Zilpah, and they both have kind of positive emotion-related names, right? One of them is good fortune, and the other is happy. So this is one of the things that James is working on actually in his thesis, which is to do with semantic similarities in the same in names in the same family. Is that true?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we kind of have an instinct even today, don't we, to name things in a kind of semantically coherent way. Like the roads where I live are all the names of trees, sort of maple, ash, and all these things. And I don't know, even operating systems do it, don't they? Leopard and whatever it is, who knows what it's like, mountain lion or is it or something? And
California.
We've moved on a few generations of operating systems.
That's yours.
I haven't.
No. He uses the one from 1942, even though
it's not broken. Don't fix it.
Right. It still works, man.
Yep. But it's it's a tendency kind of to sort of differentiate between children, obviously not going to call them the same thing, but at the same time to unite them, to give them some sort of coherence. And it's an interesting phenomenon. Interestingly, it's the kind of thing that some people have looked at the Bible and said, this is very artificial. They've looked at kind of Rachel and Leah being ewe and cow, wild cow, something like that. And they've said, these are almost Pilgrim's Progress type names. No one would actually, and yet people do exactly that. It's a very well attested sort of Arabic naming phenomenon, and probably less so in other cultures. But it's interesting that it's been used to kind of cast doubt upon a lot of narratives. Turns out to be very historically grounded as
interesting. Okay, let's press on. Maybe just summarize what happens with to get us to the next verse rather than going through all of it. Yeah,
okay. So beginning in verse 14, there's this odd-looking thing to us where Reuben goes out in the field and he finds these things called mandrakes, dudaim, dudaim is derived from or related to the word for beloved or lover, dode. And it's usually translated mandrakes, I think. It's some sort of plant that you would find presumably in the Middle East. I did look it up last night. I know what it looks like, but I still don't know much about it. But the assumption is that it's, it helps you in an amorous regard. And so he brings in the
hence it's
the
root.
Mandrake.
Is that the idea?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. It's a lover plant.
Yeah,
a loving plant. So he brings this in to his mother, to Leah, and Rachel says, give me some of your mandrakes. And she says, well, don't really want to do that, in not so many words. Yeah. And Rachel says, well, then fine. You sleep with them tonight. I'll sleep with them tomorrow night. And so begins again. I think we're in verse 17. God listened to Leah, and she conceived, and she brought forth to Jacob a fifth son. And Leah said, God has given my wage, my reward, because I gave my female servant to my husband, and she called his name Yissachar. So the connection here is between the word for wage, my wage, in verse 18, God has given my wage, and it seems that Yissachar, however you analyze that name, contains the same root, sakar, which is the wage word, or to give a wage, or something like that. The different ways of analyzing the name, and I emphasized earlier that often that's the case. There are lots of options, and we have to decide between what seems the most likely. One option for analyzing the name is that it means there is a wage, so yesh sakar. And there's been some development in the sounds in the name, if that's the case.
But the preservation of the orthography kind of suggests that, doesn't it? We should say, so it's almost like a Kativ Kare that we were talking about earlier. It's not exactly the same, but it's got, how should we put it? It's got sort of two S's in the middle, if you like, which gives you a slight clue as to how you should etymologize it. It's preserved oddly in Hebrew, isn't it?
I see, yes. Yeah.
Well, I should say, I mean, you're right, that's true. It suggests that there were two S-sounding letters together. Yeah. Or it could mean that there was a T sound with an S sound. Okay. That's another option. So another way to analyze would be that this is maybe Ish Sakar, man of the wage. Right. I think that's unlikely, but it's been suggested. And then the other way is that this is related to Yistakar, which would be a verb, meaning something like he has loaned himself out or hired himself out. Right. Maybe this would be one of those shortened names with a divine name. The deity has hired himself out or loaned himself out. Maybe in the sense that through some process of events, possibly an offering or something like that, the deity has now agreed to do something that for the name bearer or for the person giving the name.
Yeah.
So I personally think that there is a wage is probably the most sensible way to analyze this. But I could see how it could go in other ways. And again, it's just to emphasize.
Jeremiah agrees with you.
Does he?
Yeah, I think so.
Well, okay.
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah. But there's this very interesting thing, isn't there? No, you go. Well, so I did find this. Okay, so Jeremiah 31, he's talking about Rachel's. So this is the backdrop of the Jeremiah's statement of the new covenant, and talking about Rachel's barrenness and lack of sons, kind of thing. And then it's talking about how she needs to be comforted, and this is kind of describing the exile in a future way, but it's looking back at Rachel's life and talking about how she's losing her sons, and then it kind of introduces this note of comfort, ki yesh sachar lifulatech. So, like, for your behaviour, there will be consolation or a reward, and you wonder if it's casting a slightly positive light upon Rachel's behaviour, although you wouldn't get that impression just reading the narrative, because it seems like there is reconciliation after that. The striving roots and name statements go, after this incident, and you wonder if it's brought the sisters closer together in some way, which actually is what Jeremiah goes on to talk about in Jeremiah 31. The new covenant is going to bring Israel and Judah, who've been referred to as sisters in chapter 3.
That's a very interesting connection.
Yeah. Striving is an interesting feature, and even striving with God. I mean, this is said earlier, but also, of course, Jacob famously wrestles with God.
Yes.
Different term, but Naphtali, it's not patal, but it's, I forgot the word, but it's a different term. So it's a theme throughout. Again, as James was saying earlier, I think an excellent case for this is the name Isaac, Yitzchak, which means he laughed, I think, or he laughs. Because when the Lord says in Genesis 17 that Isaac is going to be born, Abraham laughs. And then later on in Genesis 18, the Lord comes and says Isaac is going to be born, and Sarah laughs and says she didn't laugh, and the Lord says, no, you did. And then the boy's name will be Isaac. And then later on when he's born, Sarah talks about people laughing in respect to this, and then Ishmael laughs, apparently derisively. And what's interesting is that each one of those, there's a lot of room for interpretation as to what the laughter means about the person's inner feelings and and beliefs about the situation. Clearly with Sarah in the first instance, she's not trusting what the Lord is saying about it all. Maybe Abraham in the first instance in chapter 17 does believe the Lord, but laughs at the remarkable nature of it. Yeah. Difficult to know. Presumably Ishmael is making fun of the boy. So there's this complexity, but within a kind of unity across the narratives, and the name is connecting it together. It's a remarkable thing.
That's very helpful.
We have two more to do very quickly. So Zebulun?
Right. Well, that's a very interesting case. So, so verse 20, Leah said, God has endowed me, gifted me with a good endowment, a good gift. And that's the word zeved. The word for gift is zeved, and the verb endowed is zavad. It's a rare term. It only occurs here. This time, my husband will, honor me, maybe? Exalt me?
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah. Because I have brought forth to him 6 sons, and she called his name Zavulun. Now, in the first instance, she uses this word zavad, verb, and then zeved, noun, gift. The theme is gifting. God has gifted me, a good gift. And then she uses the verb zaval, which sounds similar to the verb zabad. It has the same first 2 sounds, 2 consonants, just with a different third consonant. And then she names the boy in connection with that second verb, zaval and zavulun, right? There's a similar sound, probably a similar sense as well, maybe. I mean, one possible explanation for zavulun is that it means something like exalted. It could also mean something like prince, which is probably related to the exalted sense. But either way, there's a kind of complexity going on here, and it's not just limited to the word zaval, the root that's shared with the name. It also extends to the other roots used, zavad, which sounds similar to them, and is to do with this gifting. So the point is that there's a sophistication to the way that the narrative is formed around different roots for what's going on in the context. It's quite remarkable.
Yeah,
that's helpful.
And then we have Dinah, who we have no explanation for, but Dinah is not going to be the progenitor of one of the tribes of Israel. So I presume
She's
that's
not.
the reason we're not given any information, or is there another reason?
Yes, there is another reason. Yes. So you want to say in
No, you go.
34, in chapter 34, that's right. That's the right chapter, I think.
Yeah.
So Dinah is taken away and raped by this man named Shechem, son of Hamor, and as a result, they're tricked, right? So they want to. Shechem wants to marry Dinah, and the sons of Israel give as a condition that they should be circumcised. So all the town of Shechem circumcise themselves, and while they're in their pain, Simeon and Levi go and kill them all, right? So that's an upcoming story, and the narrative in the Bible often does this. It will raise a character and something about the character that you don't see why it matters yet, but eventually it matters, right? This is done at the end of chapter 11 with Sarah being barren. Yep. That becomes key to the story, and what we're told early on before it becomes key that she is.
Yeah,
I think that's what's going on here. What do you think?
Well, no, I agree, and the meaning of the name almost looks forward to that incident to some extent, doesn't it? I mean, how would you translate it? Just justice, like as an abstract thing? I mean, it raises the question, doesn't it? At the end of chapter 34, I mean, okay, the person who raped Dinah is punished, which is a good thing, but is Dinah in a better position for that having been done? It sort of raises all the complex questions, and it's. I mean, the whole thing is a mess, isn't it? Basically,
It is. Let's just get on to the last son of this section. Benjamin will leave for today because he comes quite a bit later in the narrative. Let's just talk about Joseph finally today.
Yes. Okay. So verse 22, God remembered Rachel, and he listened to her. God listened to her, and he opened her womb. And she conceived, and she brought forth a son. And she said, God has gathered my reproach, literally. And she called his name Yosef, saying, the Lord has added, or maybe better, may the Lord add to me another son. So there's some ambiguity here. On the one hand, when Rachel gave Bilhah, her female servant, to Jacob, and Bilhah brought forth a son, Rachel called that boy hers. She said, "This is my son." So here, does she mean the Lord has added to me another son? Or should we read in an expectation of the coming of Benjamin eventually, who's born in chapter 35? So I tend to take the second view. I think that makes better sense because of the form of the word Yosef, which looks like a kind of volative form. Right. That means that it indicates some kind of involvement of the speaker in expectation, a wish, a hope, a command, or something like that. So may the Lord add to me another son. So that would be my view. But there is a connection here with the word gather, asaf, there in verse 23. God has gathered my reproach. So asaf shares its last two consonants with the word for add, yasaf, which is the base, it seems, of Joseph's name. And God gathering my reproach, it seems to me, is then brought in parallel with adding, with Joseph's name. And so here we have not a lexical connection, and not even really a semantic connection, but just a phonological connection in the context, Asaf with Yasaf.
Yes.
That's a nice point. I hadn't thought about that. Asaf can be like to take away, can't it? As in, sort of, I think there's a psalm, was it the Lord will take away their breath. And it's nice then that that's to take away, but Yasaf is to add, and it captures that whole just reproach that's associated with barrenness,
It's great.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, gentlemen, thank you very much. That's been a really fascinating discussion.
Right.
It feels a bit mean to leave Benjamin out, doesn't it? But
He's a long way on, though, isn't he?
He is a long way on. We'll
it's an
pick
interesting case, though.
Okay, we'll see if we can pick Benjamin up in a future episode.
Good.
James, Caleb, thank you so much.
Thank
you.
you.
Yeah.